Welcome, everyone. Fruits of the Orchard, Parshat Bo. In Fruits of the Orchard this week, we have 3 articles, and we're going to probably just get to the first 2. And if we have time, we'll get to the 3rd. And the first one is from a very interesting verse that many people might not pay that much attention to, but it was the basis of a very, very important philosophical foundation of the whole Hasidic movement. And so this verse is found in Shemot Yud Chaf Daled through Chaf Vav, that is Exodus chapter 10, verses 24 through 26. So I'm just going to read in English. It said this is the many, many times that Moshe comes to Pharaoh and let my people go. And there's a little bit of negotiations that go on and warnings, etc. So here, after the plague of the locusts, which was the 7th plague, so Pharaoh calls Moshe and says, Pharaoh summoned Moshe and said, "Go, worship God, but your flocks and your cattle shall be left. Your young children may also go with you." So again, like I said, there's these negotiations. And this is like Pharaoh's defenses are breaking down now here. Now he says, oh, the men can go, and even the children can go, but your cattle can't go. So Moshe answers him like this. Moshe said, "You too shall give sacrifices and burnt offerings into our hands, and we will make them for God our God. And also our cattle will go with us. Not a single hoof will remain, for we will take from it to worship God our God." And this is the important part here. "For we do not know how we will worship God until we arrive there." So in other words, Moshe is saying, very nice, Pharaoh, that you're giving permission for the men to go and the children. But I'm telling you, not only is all of us going to go with everything that we have, but you're also going to give over sacrifices that we are going to then give to God. And the last of the verse is, that, in a sense, the reason Moshe gives is, why do we have to bring all the cattle? Because we don't know how we are going to worship God until we get there. So this idea that we don't know how we're going to serve God till we get there is, in a sense, the general idea that the Baal Shem wanted to emphasize, the idea of spontaneity. The Baal Shem Tov taught very, very strongly this idea that how on a daily level we need to break out of our routines, out of our rote habits. Doesn't mean throw everything to the wind, but for example, we pray the same prayers 3 times a day. Shachrit is pretty much the same every day. Mincha is pretty much the same, and Ma'ariv is pretty much the same. So the Baal Shem wasn't saying, well, no, we shouldn't daven Shachrit, Mincha, and Ma'ariv, but what he was saying is, we need to do it fresh every day with new kavanah. And this was a very, very important part of the teachings of the Baal Shem Tov. We'll call it spontaneity. So there is a story that Rav Ginsburg is very, very fond of telling. And this is a story of Saadia Gaon. Saadia Gaon was one of the great leaders approximately 1,000 years ago in Babylonia. Babylonia was still the main center of Jewish life around 1,000 years ago. And then it moved towards Spain and Europe. But at that time, he was one of the great leaders. And so one time he went to a town, and even though he was quite famous, in that particular town, not everyone knew who he was. And he needed hospitality. And so it was arranged for him to sleep at one of the people's houses. And the host was so kind and so generous. And it seemed like he couldn't do enough for his guest. When it came time to leave, the Saji Gaon thanked him profusely and gave him blessings, and he left. Shortly afterwards, one of his neighbors came over and said, "How did it feel hosting the great Saji Gaon?" And he was like in shock. He had no idea that the person that he hosted was the great Saji Gaon. And so he ran after him and he caught him and he said, "Oh, please forgive me that I didn't do more for you. I didn't know who you were." And so the Saji Gaon said, "What do you mean? You were like a perfect host. I can't imagine you like you're being kinder or more generous than you were." And the man said, "But if I would have known who you were, I would have tried even harder to host you." And so Rav Ginsburg says the teaching from this is in our relationship with life in general, but especially with God, that it's as if every day we could say to God, "Oh, if I would have known yesterday what I know today about my connection to you, about your greatness, I would have served you so much better." So this is, like I said, this is a story that Rav Ginsburg is very fond of telling, and it really emphasizes what the Baal Shem Tov was trying to teach. Now, the Radomsker Rebbe has a little bit different take on it, and he concentrates or focuses on this part of the verse where it says, "You too shall give sacrifices and burnt offerings into our hands, and we will make them for God our God." So here, the Radomsker says, this could be seen to apply to, we'll call it a Baal Tshuva. In other words, someone who is steeped in a different lifestyle and uses their passions and their desires for, we'll call it more physical attainments. And then they become more religious. And so they can learn, the Radomsker says that we can learn that the same passion we used to maybe even sin, that same passion can now be channeled for the good. And that's one of the reasons that the sages said that in the place that a Baal Tshuva, someone who returns to the faith, to observance, where they stand, even a great righteous person who's never sinned in their whole life can't stand. Because a Baal Tshuva has experienced this kind of passion and now can apply it to the good. So the Radomsker said that that's what we could learn from this verse. When Moshe says, "You too," talking to Pharaoh, who's not the most righteous person, "You too shall give sacrifices and burnt offerings into our hands, and we will make them for God our God." So the Radomsker is saying that we can take from this idea of desire and passion and turn it into something very, very good. But then he says at a certain point, we should be able to, in a sense, switch gears and be able to produce that kind of desire and passion totally from a holy place. without the need to, in a sense, draw from that kind of energy that at one time was used perhaps for not such good things. And we're actually told, Rashi tells us, when we say the very important verse after the Shema, that you shall love your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. So the word for heart there, b'chol levavcha, is technically a plural verb. And so Rashi says we learn from this that we should serve God with both of our inclinations, with both our, what's called the evil inclination, Yetzer Hara, and the Yetzer Tov, and the good inclination. Again, meaning that sometimes the energy that at one point went to not such good places, but if we direct that to a good place, then it's very positive. Now, the one of the Slonim Rebbes, Rebbe Shmuel of Slonim, so he had even a different take on this same verse, and here he concentrates on the idea that we don't know how we'll serve God until we get there. And it's a very, very interesting matter. In the beginning of Hasidut, because of the Baal Shem Tov's influence, and in a sense, based on what Maimonides says that if you want to break a habit, sometimes you have to go to the opposite extreme so that you'll end up back in the middle. This is like a general principle. It doesn't always work like this, but he said that many times we have to go to the other extreme to find the right balance. So in the beginning of the Hasidic movement, because the Baal Shem was trying to teach this idea of spontaneity, so prayer became a very lively exercise with lots of singing and dancing and jumping up and down. And there's stories of people doing somersaults and standing on their head and cartwheels in order to like arouse a holy passion. So this Slonim Rebbe said that we shouldn't do that hoping that we will arrive there. In other words, if that kind of prayer comes from the depths of our heart, and that is how we can express it the best way possible, that's okay. But there was a feeling in the second, third generation of Hasidut already, let alone the opponents of Hasidut, that it seemed that maybe people were getting into a rote of these kind of extreme ways of praying. And so we could just look at the Chabad movement. What's very, very interesting is it's told about the Alter Rebbe. Now, the Alter Rebbe who started the Chabad movement was an intellectual on the highest level. The Tanya is such an incredible teaching, and he was all about Chabad, is Chachma, Bina, and Dat, wisdom, understanding, and knowledge coming from the head. The head has to rule over the heart. Nonetheless, it's told about the Alter Rebbe that when he davened like the Baal Shem Tov. He was like all over the place. And they said that sometimes he would begin in one corner of the room, and it wasn't even a conscious thing. Just through his motions and his movement, he'd end up on the other side of the room completely. And then his son, the Mittler Rebbe, in a sense, went the complete opposite direction. And he was not in favor of this kind of outward manifestation of joy. He felt it should be a much more inner, private kind of prayer to Hashem. So of course, there is no right and wrong here. And you'll see in the world today, there's different communities. For example, the Karliner Hasidim are famous for yelling their prayers. Everyone, not just the one leading it, that they say their prayers out loud in loud voice. And let's say in Breslov, there's a lot of clapping. A lot of clapping happens during prayer. Rabbi Nachman explained, we'll say, the secrets of clapping. Others, there's dancing after every prayer, on Shabbos, on Yantif. And every community has their way, and there's no right or wrong here. But I'm just pointing out what the Slonim Rebbe said, that we shouldn't, in a sense, force spontaneity if it's not really there, or force outward manifestations of joy just for the sake of it, or with the hope that it might arouse something. If it comes from the depths of the heart, then by all means. So this was a very, very just interesting thing coming from this verse, that we don't know how we're going to serve God until we get there. So as I said in the beginning, it doesn't mean that we're, God forbid, throwing tradition away and calling that rote. No, we have mitzvot and we have prayers and we do them on a regular basis. But what we're thinking about and our attitude towards them and the inner light and the inner joy that we're expressing should be, as much as possible, different every day. That's why it says in the Mishnah, don't make your prayers keva. Don't just repeat them day after day after day without making the effort to put new thought into them, new feeling, new kavanah. So this was the first article in Fruits of the Orchard this week. The next one is actually the first article and is truly one of the deepest subjects. We're going to do our best in the time that we have to look at as many angles as we can. And the name of the article is called The Great Paradox. So what paradox are we talking about? So it's given over, and actually if you follow the verses, the first 5 plagues, it says, the text says specifically that Pharaoh hardened his heart. In other words, who's this Moshe coming? Who's this God they're talking about? And even though there was plague after plague, Pharaoh is just, he doesn't grasp what's happening. He doesn't believe it. He's too invested in his power. So it says over and over again that Pharaoh hardened his heart. Already by the 6th plague, the text starts saying, and God hardened Pharaoh's heart. This is a very, very well-known idea here that is talked about greatly. But what comes out of it is a big question. Is, first of all, and we're gonna talk about this more, if at the what's called the covenant of the pieces, Brit Ben Batarim, this is when God appears to Abram and tells him that your seed, your children are going to be oppressed by a foreign nation for 400 years. And after 4 generations, you will come out and back to Israel with great wealth. So the question becomes not only for Pharaoh in Egypt, but for every Jew, if this was the prophecy, this was the destiny, God is telling Avram, this is how it's going to be, then the question is, does anyone have free will? How did anyone have free will when it was already determined what would happen? That's the question. We're going to deal with that. We're going to see it's not so simple and it's not so black and white. But this is just our starting point. And Rambam asks us about Pharaoh. He says specifically in Mishneh Torah, why is Pharaoh culpable if, in a sense, he is just fulfilling the destiny that God has determined must take place? Why is he blamed? So the way Maimonides, the Rambam, answers this really is, and this starts to open up the picture, is that even though this was determined, it could have happened in 1,000 ways. The oppression could have been very slight, let's say, like high taxes. Pharaoh, no slavery, but there were high taxes, so you're going to be oppressed and under someone's heel. Or it could end like killing all of the firstborn and drowning the babies and putting babies in the wall for the mortar. Now, in the prophecy that God gives over, it's not determined how anything will actually play itself out. And as we see, God says for 400 years, but Rashi and others tell us we were actually only in Egypt for 210 years. So you'll say, well, what happened? What happened to this destiny? What happened to this prophecy? So this is what I'm about to say is a very, very important statement about all prophecy. And we're given over a general principle that all, what we'll call them negative prophecies, do not have to happen the way that the prophet gives it over. They could be avoided altogether. As we see, for example, when Jonah goes to Nineveh and says, Nineveh is going to be overturned. That's it. Nineveh is finished. It's going to be overturned. But it says that the king and the people, they fasted, and for at least for that moment, they did tshuva. And so the Ramchal says Jonah was a true prophet, but even a true prophet, he didn't understand that Nineveh will be turned over, that it could be that Nineveh will be turned over in tshuva. Jonah didn't pick up on that. And he was a true prophet. So with Brit Ben Avatarim, the covenant of the pieces, the general idea is given over, but how everyone's going to act out this destiny is not determined. And that's where free will comes in. And that's a very, very important point. The second part of the general principle of prophecy is all of the good prophecies will and must happen. They're all fated, determined to happen. So that's something very good, because if you look at the prophets, we have some great prophecies about Mashiach, world redemption, world peace. And for thousands of years, we've trusted and have had emunah shlema that these good prophecies will be manifest. And of course, here in Israel, we are seeing them. We are living them. The whole Jewish people now are living the return to Zion. That was, for those who were here at the beginning, the song we played, V'havi'enu el Tzion ircha b'rina. Please bring us back to Zion in great joy. And here we are. Here we are, Rosh Chodesh Shvat in Eretz Yisrael. So all the good prophecies will happen. So now we'll go back to Rambam, and he is explaining, well, what does it mean that God hardened his heart? That implies that he no longer had free will. And so the Rambam gives us another general principle that in Jewish thought, and again, this is a very important statement, when you take the two seemingly opposites, the great paradox between human beings having free will, real free will, and what's called God's omniscience, that God sees the future, he knows the future before it happens, and what's called divine providence. When you take these two things and you try to balance them, so many religions or philosophical paths lean heavily towards one or the other, either towards free will, let's say existential philosophy. Well, there is no God, there is no divine providence, there's only matter of coincidence, evolution, and all there is man's free will. There are other philosophies that believe very, very strongly that everything is determined and we have very little free will. Judaism makes a huge effort to believe in both of them simultaneously, to embrace the paradox. And even within Jewish thought, there are different teachers that lean more towards one or the other. But in general, Jewish thought is very, very much that they're both true at the same time. We have to try to understand it. There are places where if someone is living on the street or begging, it's, well, I have no obligation to help. If God knows what he's doing, they must deserve to be a beggar and poor and sick. So of course, that's not our way of seeing things. That's not our way of seeing things, but there is a place in the world that certain people if a person is born a certain way, I don't have an obligation. I might decide to have compassion, but if a person is in a certain situation, it's because, especially because of reincarnation, that's what they deserve. They must have done something that they deserve to be in that position. That is not our way of looking at the world at all. It's not for us to decide why someone is in a certain position. Our role is to help. It's God's job to figure out why everything is going on. We are there to try to help and alleviate pain. So the Rambam says that if a person abuses their free will enough, it for all practical purposes, it is taken away. That it's like a person abdicates their ability to have free will. And so that's how the Rambam explains that God hardened his heart, because at that point, he had sinned so much and he had done so much evil that the it's not automatic that a person has total free will. Another explanation, in a sense, is just the opposite, that it was becoming so obvious. Now, if you look in this week's Parsha, after when Moshe declares the 8th plague of locusts, so the wise men of Egypt come to Pharaoh. It's an incredible verse. And they say to him, let the people go. Don't you see that Egypt is destroyed? Like, these are his own advisors. And so you would say, what is that teaching us? Well, actually, you see this being played out in almost every generation, especially the last few hundred years, where there's constant revolutions going on everywhere. And you'll have whoever the dictator is, who doesn't understand that it's all about to come crashing down. And they're holding out to the end as if nothing is going to change. And you see this, there have been hundreds of revolutions in the last couple hundred years. Before that, things were a bit more status quo, we'll say it like that. But from the American Revolution and the French Revolution and the Russian Revolution, and in China and all over the world right now, the dictator hangs on to the end. And then in our day, if he's lucky, he jumps on a plane at the last minute and he goes into exile and the whole thing collapses. Or like Saddam Hussein, who they actually found him in like trying to hide in a ditch, literally in the ground, because he didn't see that it was ending. The Torah is everlasting. That verse that the wise men say to Pharaoh, let the people go. Don't you see that Egypt is destroyed? But Pharaoh didn't listen to them either. So one of the explanations is that God had to harden his heart in order to actually give him the choice whether to let the people go or not, because it became so obvious that he had to let the people go, which eventually he did. So God was trying to, in a sense, make an even playing field. But that's a very, very valid explanation. But I personally like very much the Rambam's, and you can see it very much in addiction, that the more a person gets addicted, and it could be drugs, it could be gambling, it could be sex, it could be food, whatever it is, the harder and harder it gets to extricate oneself from the addiction. It's possible. It's always possible. Ein davar omeid lifnei haratzon. Nothing stands in the way of will. And it also says, Ein davar omeid lifnei tshuva. Nothing stands before tshuva. Nonetheless, on a practical level, the more a person is addicted, the harder it gets, literally by day to break that addiction. And many, many people do and end up going back because they can stay clean for a certain amount of time. And again, it's possible, it's absolutely possible to break it through tshuva. But in a certain way, a person has lost that ability. They become a slave to their addiction. Okay, now, so let's go back to the covenant of the pieces and this prophecy or this destiny that God reveals to Abraham. And we see that it didn't happen exactly how it was said, because we're taught that Israel reached the 49th level of impurity. And God, in a sense, had to take them out then before it's too late. Almost like we're just saying that God understood that when a person reaches, let's say, the 50th, again, this is symbolic language, reaches the 50th level of Tumah, in a sense, on a practical level, there's no way out. So when Israel reached the 49th level, God quickened the prophecy here and took them out earlier, 190 years earlier. There's a hint to this in the Haggadah, where the word kates, that God saw the end, and kates is gematria 190. God saw that he better act now. So now we're going to go back to the selling of Yosef. When Yaakov sends Yosef to check up on his brothers, I believe we learned this already, but it's good to go over it. It says he sent them from Emek Hebron, from the valley of Hebron. And in a classic Rashi says, wait a minute, Hebron's in the mountains. Hebron's not in a valley. What does it mean, Emek Hebron? So Rashi says he sent him. Now you have to understand the word for a valley, Emek, is the same root as the word deep. Now that makes sense. A valley is deep between two mountains or two cliffs. But just a word that something is very deep or getting to the depth of a matter is omek. So Rashi says he sent him from the deep Eitzah of that tzaddik who's buried in Hebron, that and it's understood he's talking about Brit Ben Abitarim. So this leads the question that's been going on for 3,500 years is, what did Yaakov understand when he sent Yosef to check up on his brothers? Did he understand that he was setting in motion this prophecy that for sure Avram gave over to Yitzhak and Yitzhak gave over to Yaakov? Did Yaakov know what he was setting in motion? Or here's where divine providence and free will dovetail. And because he was such a righteous person, he, without even knowing, he was a channel for this prophecy to begin to be manifest. So he didn't send him like, I know what I'm sending you to. Now this happens with the same thing with the selling of Yosef. Later, when Yosef reveals himself, so 2 different times he makes an important statement to them. The first time he says, don't feel bad that you sold me, because God sent me before you, so I'll be able to feed you. Remember, there was a famine in the whole world. That's why the brothers came down to Egypt in the first place. So he says to them, don't feel sad. Don't feel guilty that you sold me. God had a greater plan here. You didn't even know it, but you were fulfilling a higher destiny. So now this is where free will comes in, because if you believe in the extreme that the brothers had no free will here, they were agents. They were a channel through which the beginning of the exile in Egypt had to take place. So then that takes away the most important thing about free will is responsibility. And that is something that Judaism believes in very strongly, that even if something is destined, we still have a certain amount of free will. So the brothers sold Joseph for their own purposes. They weren't selling him to fulfill a prophecy. They were sold him because they were jealous, because they were upset, whatever it was. And it's much deeper than what it appears. As callous and cruel as it seemed, there's a much deeper level here that the brothers thought they were being righteous. So here we could see that the brothers had free will, and yet at the same time, that's called the great paradox. They were channels for a much greater destiny. Later, after Yaakov passes away, so Yosef says to them, you don't feel bad. You meant to do me evil. God meant it for the good. Now you can imagine what kind of level Yosef was on, that he was able to forgive his brothers, to get on with his life, and get beyond all of the negative feelings that you could imagine that your own brothers sold you into slavery. He was that righteous that he was able to see how this all fit into God's plan. So that's when we call this the great paradox. So that's what we mean. So going back to Pharaoh, again, in the prophecy, it doesn't say that he has to drown all the baby boys. And I think we mentioned this already. We read these stories of the plagues and Pharaoh, the drowning of the boys, and also there's a point where Pharaoh was leprous, and he bathed in the blood of Jewish babies. So if we didn't have the Holocaust, we could like, maybe it was like that, maybe it wasn't like, but the things that happened in the Holocaust, the inhuman cruelty, in a sense, can teach us that we went through this in Egypt. It's for real. These traditions of the cruelty of the Egyptians should be taken literally. So that's where we could say that Pharaoh is culpable, because it didn't have to be like that. It could have been in many different ways. And I also, just an aside, when the brothers, when Yaakov sees there's a famine, and he sends the brothers to get food. This is before they've even met Yosef. The verse says, redu. He like kind of not commands, but he instructs him, go down to Egypt, and because I see there's shever in Mitzrayim. Here, shever means sustenance, grain, food. But Rashi even says, Rashi brings a gematria, and he says, redu is gematria 210. That again, did Yaakov understand what was happening by sending all the other brothers down? Or again, I would say most likely that a spiritual person, a tzaddik, becomes a vessel for God's will in this world. But Rashi points out, redu, go down. This is a prophecy of the 210 years. So now I just want to mention something very, very important, because the exile in Egypt is the archetypal exile. The Torah spends a number of portions, and then the whole rest of the Torah is we've gotten out of slavery, we're on our way to Israel. So even though the actual slavery is given over in a total of 4 parshas, but it is such a central focus of the Torah itself. Our prayer is every day we mention coming out of Egypt. And of course, it's the central focus of Pesach. So there's a question. We talk all the time about 4 exiles: Babylonia, Persia, Greece, and Rome. And this is brought down all over the place, all over the place. So the question is, what happened to Egypt? Why isn't Egypt included in the 4 exiles? And so here, this is part of our discussion. So I'm quoting from the Netivat Shalom, who says like this, very, very deep idea, and this is connected to the Rashi, who explains Emek Chevron, and he says he sent him from the Eitzah, the deep advice of the tzaddik who's buried in Hebron. He's talking about Avram. So the Slonim Rebbe says there's something fundamentally different about the exile in Egypt and the other ones. Now, there's actually a number of mystical reasons, but he's, in a sense, addressing a more practical. He says that the 4 exiles, Babylonia, Persia, Greece, and Rome, are always connected to our actions. That when we didn't do properly, like the destruction of the 2 temples, the prophets came over and over and over again and told the people, if you don't change your ways, the temples are going to be destroyed and you're going to go into exile. But you have the power and the ability to change your ways. And then it won't happen. But they didn't change their ways, and it happened. And so the Netivat Shalom explains that all 4 of our exiles are connected to our actions, to the usage of our free will in a way that we shouldn't have. So he says, though, Egypt is different. When God came to Avram, and the Netivat Shalom says an amazing thing that's connected to this idea of what's this deep advice of Avram. So the Netivat Shalom says God came to him and said, Avram, for you to be the holy people, for you to fulfill your mission in the world, for you to have the wisdom, the intellect and the heart to fix this world and to be a light unto the nations, you need to experience slavery in Egypt. Meaning, only through experiencing that will you be able to be sensitive to all peoples who suffer and are oppressed, and act as best as you can. And the Netivat Shalom says, God asked Avram, are you up to this? Are you ready for this? Are you willing to take this upon yourself? And Avram said, God, if this is your will, if this is what we need to go through in order to be your holy people, then I have, in a sense, I have to agree. But in principle, he could have said, God, this is too much. So here again, this is a great paradox. And this is what Rashi, whether he knew it or not, was alluding to when he said that Yaakov sent Yosef from the deep advice of that tzaddik who's buried in Hebron. In other words, it wasn't just God laid it upon him. I always found this explanation just very awesome. I think it's an awesome explanation of understanding, just like the simple question, why isn't Egypt? Why don't we talk about 5 exiles? Why 4 exiles, and why isn't Egypt included? And as we explained, he said, this is in a category of its own. It's not like the other 4, which is, we'll call it a mida keneged mida. Remember, that's what we learned last week. That was our theme for the class last week, a measure for a measure. Cause and effect, reward and punishment. All those different things got played out in these four exiles. Now, to emphasize this paradox, in the book of Devarim, in Deuteronomy, a good part of the book is what we'll term blessings and curses. Over and over and over again, God puts forth to the Jewish people a formula. If you follow the Torah, if you just believe in one God, no idol worship, you follow the commandments, you're going to have everything good. We say it in the Shema every single day, twice every day. If you follow God and the commandments, you'll have the rain in its season. Everything will be good for you. You'll eat, you'll be satisfied, everything will be good. And if not, terrible curses are going to happen. Now, we could look at that as if, in a certain way, God is blessing us and also cursing us. But really, it's more a result of our free choice. If we follow God and we choose to do so, then everything is going to be good. So all through the book of Devarim, this theme is played out over and over again. And at one point, this is the only time that free will is mentioned, where God says, I put before you today good and evil, life and death, ubecharta b'chaim, and you shall choose life. And this is, in Hebrew, free will is bechira chofshit, the same word, choose life. Choice, we have choice. Choice goes back to Eitz Hadat Tov V'Ra. Goes back to the tree of knowledge of good and evil, where God put before them choice. You have everything. You have Gan Eden. Just one thing don't do. One thing. Don't eat from the Eitz Hadat Tov V'Ra. And the way we learn it is, if they would have waited just a little while, they could have first eaten from the Eitz HaChaim and then the Eitz Hadat. So this verse, ubecharta b'chaim, this is the source, the Torah source for free will. And yet, after that, in Parshat Hazinu and V'yelech, God says, now I'm going to tell you what's going to happen. And Moshe even tells the people, you're going to come into Israel, you're going to be wealthy, you're going to grow fat, you're going to abandon God, and all of these curses are going to come upon you. So here again, we'll ask the question, wait a minute. If the Torah is already telling us what's going to happen, do we have free will to avoid that? This is a classic question, and that's where we get into the paradox. That's where we get to the paradox, where we can maintain at all times this idea that we do have free will. As Rabbi Akiva said in Pirkei Avot, in the 3rd chapter, the 19th Mishnah, everything is foreseen, yet the freedom of choice is given. This is probably the most exact and, like, let's cut to the chase here, statement about this whole question that we're discussing. Rabbi Akiva gets right to the heart of the matter and says they're both true simultaneously. And you can't have one without the other. Again, everything is foreseen, yet, he uses the word, yet the freedom of choice is given. The world is judged in goodness, and everything depends on the abundance of good deeds. So this Rabbi Akiva got it in a nutshell. The paradox. He doesn't explain how we understand it, but at least he's putting before us that they're both true. We have to embrace both of them because we believe in divine providence. We believe that for God, we even know scientifically at the speed of light, no time passes. Well, God is the creator of light. How much more so is the mystery of how for God, past, present, and future are all known to him simultaneously. So I'll end with one more idea. Again, my idea was not to come up with solutions. In fact, I'll give my solution at the end. But one more way to see the paradox, and this is at Har Sinai, at Mount Sinai, in the days leading up to the giving of the Torah. So God tells Moshe, go tell the people what's about to happen. And then the people respond, and Moshe takes the response back and forth. It's all in Parshat Yitro. And at one point, the people say, Na'aseh v'nishma. We will do and we will hear. We will listen to God, even if we don't understand the reasons. That if God is telling us, we're choosing that we're going to follow God, we're going to accept the mitzvot, even without seeing them, without hearing them. We're going to accept them. And then you have the Midrash that says because in the text it says they stood at the bottom of the mountain. In fact, we just learned this a few weeks ago. What does it mean they stood at the bottom of the mountain? So one of the sages says that God held the mountain over their head and said, if you receive the Torah today, good. And if not, this will be your burial place, meaning I'll drop the mountain on your head. So the obvious question is, wait a minute, we just said Na'aseh v'nishma. We just said the epitome of free will, the epitome of responsibility. So why did they have to come up with this drasha that God is going to hold the mountain over their heads? And I remember we discussed this just a few weeks ago, and I gave my take, and I remember, I think it was Bracha who came up with a different take. I can't remember it right now. Maybe she'll remind us. But here we see what God is teaching them is, I appreciate your accepting through your free will the Torah. But I want you to know on a certain level, it's beyond your choice. The destiny that you have to receive the Torah and to be my holy people, this is beyond choice. And it's important to realize that. And so the way I relate to it, and I mentioned this, I don't remember the context, but we just went over this a few weeks ago, is the situation in Israel today. I don't mean the politics. I mean that, I'll just take myself as an example, but I represent the vast majority of people here who made a clear, free choice decision to make Aliyah to Israel. And I remember saying it's one of the most difficult and most fundamental choices. You change your country, you change your language, you change your whole society. That's like a huge choice that we make. And yet, there's a bigger picture happening, and that's all the prophecies of the prophets who said that in the end of days, I will gather you from the four corners of the world, and I will bring you back to Israel, and you will rebuild the land, and the land will turn green again. And in the end, there'll be a third temple, and Mashiach will come, and there'll be a full redemption of the world. So then we can ask, every person can ask, well, in my mind, I was exercising almost the epitome of free will. Many people debate moving to Israel for years. And so when a person finally makes a decision, it's like, what greater example of free will can you say? Now, many Jews, especially right after the War of Independence, were forced out of the Arab countries. They didn't have a choice. They were literally kicked out of Iraq and Libya and Egypt and all of these places, literally out. They didn't have a choice. They came here penniless with just a shirt on their backs. But the vast majority of Jews in Israel decided to come at some point. And yet there's a much greater destiny playing itself out. I ask myself all the time, and I see that they're both happening simultaneously. I exercise my free will, and at the same time, I was fulfilling a higher destiny that was just being channeled through me. And so we'll end with what we say in Pirkei Avot, where it says, make his will your will, in order that your will should become his will. And in a sense, that becomes we'll call it the solution to the paradox, that when our will and God's will are dovetailed, then there is no paradox. There is no paradox. And to end, I'll give you my take on, in a sense, how does this work? How does divine providence and God's omniscience work with free will? And so, let's say we'll see it in one of the teachings that there are 6 aleph in the first verse of the Torah. 6 letters, aleph. Aleph also means Eleph, which means 1,000. So the sages said that this cycle of history will last for 6,000 years, and the 7,000th will be Yemot HaMashiach, the Messianic era. We know, here's another perfect example. Isaiah says about the Messianic era, he says, give me a second. Be'ita achashena. In its time, I will hasten it. So the Gemara says, wait a minute. If it's in its time, its set time, how can it be hastened? There's a set time for Mashiach to come. And if it can be hastened, how can you say there's a set time? So the sages answer their own question and say, if we merit, we can bring it sooner. If we don't merit, there is a set time, it will happen anyways. And this becomes a huge discussion between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua, whether we have to do tshuva in order to bring it closer and to bring it at all. There's a whole debate whether we have to do tshuva and how that tshuva plays itself out. Anyways, in other words, there's a plan, there's a tochna, there's a program in the computer, and that defines the parameters of history. There's a program. How everyone fits into that program is totally gray. It can go in a million ways, a billion ways. And as each person exercises their free will, God, who is above time and is, we talked about spontaneity, but here I'll use the word is infinitely adjustable. God is infinitely adjustable. So as each person, each atom, each star, each tree, each animal, everyone is doing their thing. Well, in the computer, now we know from modern day computer, not even computers, just what we hold in our hands, can do millions, tens of millions of actions per second. And we know that the brain is actually doing that many. Just that we breathe and the heart beats and we digest our food and we can see and we can hear. The brain is called the greatest computer in the world. It is processing tens of millions of impulses per second and running the whole show. Well, God obviously is so much more than that. And so every person has free will. And God, who is infinitely adjustable, makes sure that the master plan is going to be played out. Now, it could mean that an individual will play their part in one lifetime, or 5 lifetimes, or 10 lifetimes. These are things that only God knows. That's way beyond us. But this is a way to understand how divine providence and free will are working at the same time. And when a person, let's say, is about to go off the cliff, so sometimes God will intervene and will make sure we don't fall off the cliff. Other times, God, for reasons that only He knows, will not intervene and a person goes off the cliff. And then there's a new lifetime and things work themselves out the way they work themselves out. And in that way, that's how I can even approach this paradox of how God's divine providence is active and apparent at every split second. The whole universe is being recreated every split second. And at the same time, that's one of the deepest understandings of Tselem Elohim. We're in the image of God, and that gives us free will. We're told animals don't have free will. Angels don't have free will. We have free will. We learned in this, for those who are part of the Tuesday night class, the whole series on soul, that every part of creation has soul and consciousness. But only human beings have the type of free will that's called Tselem Elohim. Nothing else is called Tselem Elohim. So I'll end with a blessing that we really learn to embrace this paradox. This paradox drives a lot of people crazy trying to figure it out. It's not clear we could ever figure it out. We all have to make our peace with it and not fight it, but to understand that we are ultimately responsible for our deeds. There's no way out of that. We are responsible for our deeds, And at the same time, we have to understand that God is ever present in our life and helping to guide us and to help us and move us forward. Sometimes only in retrospect can we see clearly, oh my gosh, like I couldn't see how I was being led in a certain direction until sometimes years later, sometimes minutes later, sometimes years later. Anyways, I bless us all to have a good Chodesh Shvat, and everyone should be blessed with everything good.